Thank you. Welcome everyone to this October 13th regular meeting of the Planning and Transportation Commission. Mr. Nguyen, will you roll the tape?
For written communications, please send an email to planning.commission@cityofpaloalto.org. Spoken comments using a computer will be accepted through the Zoom teleconference meeting. To address the commission, go to zoom.us/join. Meeting ID is 916-4155-9499. You will be asked to enter an email address and name. We request that you identify yourself by name, as this will be visible online and will be used to notify you that it is your turn to speak. When you wish to speak on an agenda item, click on Raise Hand. The moderator will activate and unmute your speakers in turn. When called, please limit your remarks to the time limit allotted. A timer will be shown on the computer to help keep track of your time. Spoken public comments using a smartphone will be accepted through the Zoom teleconference meeting. To address the commission, download the Zoom application onto your phone from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store and enter the meeting ID 916-4155-9499. Please follow steps A through D. For written communications, please send an email to planning.commission@cityofpaloalto.org. A timer will be shown on the computer to help keep track of your time. Spoken public comments using a smartphone will be accepted through a Zoom teleconference meeting. To address the commission, download the Zoom application onto your phone from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store and enter the meeting ID 916-4155-9499. Please follow steps A through D. Spoken public comments using a regular phone, call 1-669-900-6833 and enter meeting ID 916-4155-9499. When you wish to speak on an agenda item, hit *9 on your phone so we know that you wish to speak. You will be asked to provide your first and last name before addressing the board. You will be advised how long you have to speak. When called, please limit your remarks to the agenda item and the time limit allotted.
Mr. Nguyen, please conduct the roll call.
Chair Heckman,
Present.
Vice Chair Rupavar,
Present.
Commissioner Awcheck is absent. Commissioner Chang is absent. Commissioner Lowing,
Present.
Commissioner Suma is absent. Commissioner Templeton,
Here.
we have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now moving on to oral communications. This section is for the public to speak on items not on tonight's agenda. So if you have something to tell us that is not on tonight's agenda, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. On the Zoom app, there is a raise hand button on the bottom of your screen. If you are dialing in from a phone, press *9. Mr. Nguyen, are there any public speakers for oral communication?
Chair Heckman, we currently do not have any speakers.
That being so, we will move next to agenda changes, additions, and deletions. Commissioners, any of you have any of those? Seeing none, I will make one note. Commissioner Chang is currently absent, but is expected to join us at approximately 7 o'clock. So our first agenda item tonight is a study session, which is scheduled 6:15 to 7. And then we have a public hearing on 985 Channing starting at 7. I expect the study session may take longer than 45 minutes. Though it may be less since there are only 4 commissioners to talk about it. But if Commissioner Chang arrives at 7 and it appears that we have a lot still to talk about on the study session, I'm going to pause it and move us to item 3 so we can hear that pretty close to 7 o'clock. On the other hand, if we somehow finish the study session before 7 o'clock and Commissioner Chang is not yet with us, I'm inclined to take a break at least till 7 and see if she arrives so that she can hear all parts of that public hearing and participate in it. We'll move now to city official reports. Ms. Tanner, do you have a report for us?
Yes, thank you, Chair Heckman. Good evening, commissioners. Good to be with you all this evening. Just a few reports. I really want to just focus on what's coming up and what's recently passed at the City Council. A notable item is the objective standards, which you all reviewed, and the ARB, Architectural Review Board, spent many, many meetings on. The council did discuss that at their last meeting, which was not this past Monday, but last week. This Monday, City Council was canceled due to the holiday, and they did continue that item until October 25th. And then we do plan that there'll be a third objective standards hearing. It's not sure what time that will be, but the first 2 meetings were structured as a chance for council to give some direction, initial feedback on the project, and overall kind of what they're thinking. The first section and the first meeting kind of focused on the objective standards and design criteria, which was in particular the ARB's purview. The second hearing, which will be on the 25th, is intended to focus on the legislative actions, and that's what you all heard. So that might be, for example, the housing incentive program. Is that remain a legislative, or does it become something that if a project meets the standards of the program, it automatically applies? So that's intended to be the focus on the 25th. And then either later this year or early next year, we would return to council again. So something to keep watching. The October 25th meeting overall is intended to be a meeting that is primarily focused on land use items. We'll have 2 pre-screenings for the City Council on 2 different proposed developments, the objective standards. And we also will have the Q1 quarterly financial report, which is ostensibly not a planning and development services item, but is certainly timely and something that I'm sure is of interest to many folks in the city. And then at next week's City Council meeting, which is on the 18th, just want to pull up that agenda. I believe that we have one item, which is the update of commercial linkage fee, a feasibility study and proposed adoption of increasing the fee for that is paid for affordable housing from commercial development. So a fee that is assessed on commercial development that supports affordable housing. That's not an item that the commission heard. It's going straight to the council as part of their direction that they gave to us to come back this year with a potential update to that fee if the study indicated that the fee could be updated. And just generally in other city news, at the end of September, which I think is, we haven't met, I don't believe, since the end of September, although we're partway through October, the council did vote to continue remote hearings for boards and commissions till January 2022. So the City Council in November will begin hybrid meetings, and we'll begin to see how those unfold and how those take place. And they did want to make a decision about boards and commissions in January. I think we're all hoping that vaccinations continue to increase, that young people can get vaccinated, that the Delta variant doesn't resurge over the holidays, and perhaps that we may even be able to return to meetings in person without face coverings. But of course, that still may be something that is in place at the time we return. So we will continue to keep you updated as we have any more information about in-person hearings, which again, we'll watch City Council and see how they're able to pull it off and then model our hearings after theirs. With that said, I'm available for any questions if the commissioners have any.
Commissioners, any questions of staff? All right, thank you, Ms. Tanner. We will move now to our agenda item number 2. A study session to review the 2021 state legislation related to planning and housing. Who will present us with the staff report, Ms. Tanner?
We have Sheldon Ossing, and I want to take a moment just to introduce him to you all, as this is his first hearing before you as a staff member with the City of Palo Alto. Sheldon comes to us with over 20 years of professional experience in both current and long-range planning throughout California and in the public and private sector. Most recently, he was a consultant for M Group and worked with the city in that capacity for about 7 years. So we're very familiar with his work ethic, and the quality that he brings to the work. And so we're very, very happy to have him here. He is a principal planner in our long range planning division. And that group works primarily on policies, on area plans and things like that. So we're very, very excited to have Sheldon here. And so I hope you will join me in welcoming him to our team, and we're glad to have him here. So go ahead, Sheldon, and we're happy to have your presentation.
Thank you for the introduction and good evening. So this is a study session review. Let's bring up the slide here. Okay, there we go. So this is a study session review of some key housing and planning related bills. And we wanted to highlight those that would affect our work program, the way we conduct business, and those that would likely require code amendments. So we're still analyzing these new laws and strategizing a way to implement them. In this past session, there were many bills that passed and focused on housing, production, streamlining the process. And some of those bills clarified existing laws, as well as October 10th was the final day that the governor had to either sign or veto bills. So we wanted to highlight 4 most relevant bills that would likely require any code changes. And the first one is SB 8, and that's clarification to SB 330, as well as the extension of the Housing Crisis Act. SB 9 is the 2-family units in single-family zones. You probably heard the most about that one. SB 10 is a tool more than a mandate. It's to streamline zoning amendments to allow more housing near transit. And then SB 478 is the minimum floor area ratio. So first off with SB 330, this is the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. A little background on that, as SB 8 clarifies this act, requires housing development project to be subject only to the ordinance policies and standards that are adopted in effect when a preliminary application is submitted. The act defines housing development projects to mean a use that's consisting of residential units only, mixed use developments, or consisting of residential and non-residential uses with at least 2/3 of the square footage designated for residential use, and also transitional and supportive housing. So what this bill does, it extends the sunset of this act by 5 years to January 1st, 2030. It also expands upon that definition of what a housing development project is for the purposes of the act to include both discretionary and non-discretionary ministerial projects. SB 8 also applies the HCA, the Housing Crisis Act, for the construction of single dwelling units. So therefore, single dwelling units could now submit pre-applications to free zoning laws, and also may be subject to the no net loss provision in the code. It also clarifies that appeals and public meetings related to density bonuses law are now counted for the purposes of the 5 hearing limit. So staff will need to continue to implement this law, and any changes that we need to do will be forthcoming in code amendments. So SB 9, that's the one, again, that we've probably heard the most of. It applies to single family zones, and these are our R1 districts as well as our RE, that's residential estates. And we do also have some single family in our OS zones. So there are 2 components to this law. One is allows a second unit on a parcel. So that's 2 units on a parcel. It also allows for a single family lot to be split. So essentially you could have 2 parcels on the first lot and 2 parcels on the second lot. So you'd have 4 parcels, 4 units, that is, on what was formerly just 1 single family on 1 lot. So we need to consider these ministerially when certain standards are met. And so, for instance, for a two-family standards, the law has a minimum 800 square foot for each unit. It also has minimum setbacks in the rear and side of 4 feet. When considering any demolition of existing units, it cannot occur if there's a designated historic property or if there are tenants that have lived there for the past 3 years. And there's some other criteria as well. And those are listed in the attachment of the staff report. So when considering your urban lot split, some other standards there is that when splitting a lot, you have to keep at least a 60-40 lot split of the area. And the minimum lot size can be no fewer than 1,200 square feet. Now we can require access to the public right of way. So with the lot split is completed, then you cannot further split that lot. So we can't do any serial splits down the road. As well as when we're considering that using the lot split and then adding the 2 units, the maximum number of units you can have is 4 units. Some other things that we are considering are that the standards would be that these units would be subject to objective standards. We do have some in place already, like setbacks and height, but we would want to consider adding some additional ones. And then as the slide has, that there's no short-term rentals that would be allowed for these units. So we're in the process of strategizing the changes that need to be made to the code. We are expecting to develop an urgency ordinance that would come first and then followed up with a permanent ordinance. So there's some discussion about ADUs and how this sort of corresponds with SB 9. And so wanted to just summarize what you can do with existing ADU law. So you can do 1 junior accessory dwelling unit, 1 accessory dwelling unit, a lot with a single family home. And you have up to 2 detached ADUs and properties with multifamily dwellings. So we do define multifamily dwellings as 3 units. It's unclear whether a 2-family use would be considered multifamily under the state ADU laws. We'll further follow up with that. Maximum size of ADUs, depending upon you're following the state law or local codes, between 800 square feet and 1,000 square feet. The minimum size would be 150 square feet. We do have height limits of 16 feet in the R1 zone. RE and OS are taller than that. And then ADUs, they may not be sold separately from the primary unit. So with the other SB 9 law, those units could be sold separately. So SB 10, this is unlike the other laws that we're presenting today, it's a tool and not a mandate. So this is an option to allow cities to adopt an ordinance to upzone parcels up to 10 units. So this would need to comply with the city's height requirements. It needs to be in a transit-rich area. And the ordinance itself is not subject to CEQA, but the follow-up units that would, or projects would be subject to CEQA. So unless we receive direction otherwise, we would acknowledge that this is a tool and that we could use it, but we're not considering this as part of our work plan going forward. The other law of note is SB 478, and this has to do with the minimum floor area ratio. So this would apply to projects in the multifamily and mixed use zones. That includes our RM and also some commercial districts, as well as some industrial districts that allow residential mixed use projects and residential projects. The minimum FAR for projects between 3 and 7 units would be 1.0. And then the minimum FAR for projects between 8 and 10 units would be 1.25. So a lot of these zones today, the existing FAR is maximum would be 0.4, 0.6, depending upon the zoning district and the characteristics of the project. The local agencies also cannot preclude FAR because of lot coverage or minimum lot size standards. So this is something definitely we would need to consider making code changes to, and we are again working on those as part of the package to go forward. Some other notable bills that do affect how we conduct business going forward. AB 215 It has to do with housing element violations, and the state has more enforcement authority for local agency violations and increases the public review for housing elements, the time that's needed there for that. Then there's AB 537. This is with wireless telecommunications, and this provides more consistency with federal law when reviewing wireless applications. We are in the process of coming forward, kind of coming back from where we left off in February of last year for wireless telecommunications ordinance. So you'll see something later this year regarding any updates. With AB 602, with the impact fee nexus study, this provides requirements for impact fee nexus studies, such as the fee being based on square footage instead of by unit. And the review of the fee is conducted every 8 years. So that's, again, just state law that we would have to follow. AB 787 has to do with converted affordable housing units, and this authorizes local agencies to receive credits towards RENA for the conversion of above moderate income units and moderate income units. And then AB 1466 has to do with discriminatory restrictions, requires title companies when involved with recording certain documents to identify unlawfully restrictive covenants and then record a modification document. Then AB 556 had to do with wireless facilities. Although passed in legislation, the governor did veto that bill. So it's possible that could come back if the legislator were to override that. So again, we would implement these bills as necessary. And then I think there were a number of other bills that we did include, but if you have any questions about those, we'd be happy to go more deep about those. So next steps really is just review the adopted legislation, determine the appropriate follow-up staff actions. We're starting to do that now. Again, we mentioned that we'll be coming in with urgency ordinance and then a permanent ordinance. We may have to update some of our checklists and so forth to make sure we're following state law. And then we'll come back with this commission with a recommendation to the council with those. Any questions? We're happy to answer them for you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, staff. Commissioners, are there questions of staff? Commissioner, Vice Chair Rupavar.
Yeah, thank you for your welcome, for officially being, on staff and with Palo Alto. We're excited to have you. I'm definitely seen your work before and, appreciated it. I had a couple questions. Do you have a sense of what the anticipated uptake would be in Palo Alto, specifically for SB 89 and 478, the three that you flagged up front? Do you anticipate seeing a lot of applications, not a lot? Is this going to impact us? Or no, because, we don't anticipate being able to do lot splits, or we don't anticipate being able, there being enough space on current lot to put a second unit. Do you have any sort of sense?
I think we certainly had a number of inquiries about the law, and just from my conversations with some of the current planning staff about it. But we did include in our staff report the Turner Center and kind of what they thought about it. I mean, I think it's not necessarily going to be like opening the floodgates, but it certainly will be an opportunity for people that are maybe motivated to do something. So I think it's hard to say whether it's going to be a lot, but I don't think it's going to be like maybe as much as some people would fear.
Or maybe as much as other jurisdictions? Like, how would we compare to other jurisdictions? Do you have any sort of?
I don't. I mean, we can.
Yeah, no,
we can. I mean, it's so fresh. I know that we have like these meetings monthly where the different jurisdictions get together, and we're really just kind of scrambling, trying to understand, grappling with some of these issues about ADUs, for instance, and the applicability of it. But I don't think we kind of drill down to how this, sort of how many would come in necessarily.
Okay, and then have we made and this might have been just can't remember. Have we made a decision on with SB 9 after the lot splits, which allow, 2 and 2, are we also allowing ADUs on there? I know it's discretionary up to the city whether they want to allow it. Has that decision been made? Or is there current code that addresses what we're going to do? Because I know different jurisdictions are doing different things.
Yeah, I think we certainly have been discussing it, and maybe City Attorney Albert can chime in a little bit on where we're going with that.
It'll be a decision that the council will need to make, certainly for the interim ordinance, and then certainly with PTC's recommendation for the permanent. So we don't know what council will decide on that. We may approach it with a more cautious beginning, which would be to say to not have the ADUs with the lot splits, but certainly council could decide to do differently or change its mind over time as the law is in place.
Great. I had 2 more questions, Sheldon. For 787, what do you, could you clarify the RENA credit? So there's an existing unit and then you convert it to affordable? I mean, wouldn't it just count as one, or is it double credit? Could you just, I know you touched on it really quickly. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, I think I have to look at it a little closer, but I think it just has to do with how the different income levels are broken down, and you get credit for those different income levels.
Yeah, and I would add that part of it is that I don't think it's necessarily related directly to this, but for example, there's a new state agency that actually engages in the purchase of existing units for providing long-term affordability. So for example, if that agency were to purchase a home or a building, really, they do multifamily building in Palo Alto, and now it's going from being market rate to affordable, that would count as a new affordable unit for the purposes of RENA, even though it's an existing unit, but now it's income restricted. Whereas before it was market rate.
That's really helpful. That clarifies it. And then one last question. When do you anticipate the urgency ordinance being brought forth? To be able to capture these?
Right now we have December 6th as our date to bring it to council. And council's last meeting this year will be December 13th. So it'll be 1 week prior.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mr. Lowing.
Yes, a few questions on all of these, and I guess we'll just talk about all of them at once. So on SB 8, I think you said, Sheldon, that we don't have to make any adjustments, but the staff report said, well, that we do, but the staff report said no local ordinance is necessary.
I'll jump in quickly. So I think SB 8 itself technically doesn't require that we adopt something, but the fact that it's extending some of these protections and processes in the Housing Crisis Act to single dwelling units is something that we might want to look through our code and see if there's anything that we need to update in response to that.
Okay, so we'll probably do something, but it's not as urgent as the others. Is that a fair conclusion?
I think we'll be aiming to include any changes in the urgency ordinance that goes to the council in December. But this is something more where we have to do some digging as opposed to the changes kind of jumping out at us, what we'll need to.
Okay. And then on SB 9, thanks for mentioning the minimum size lot. So if I understand this correctly, if your lot is 4 times 1,200, 4,800, you can build 4 units. Is that right?
So actually, you only need to have a 2,400 square foot lot to build 4 units. You would split that lot into 2 1,200 square foot lots, and then you'd be able to build 2 units on each of those resulting lots.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll have to see how that plays out with setbacks and access to the street, things like that. And then another thing that you want to look at on the ADU issue is, sometimes chicken and egg, the ADU might be there first. And then what do you do to the added units versus if the units go in and then later somebody wants an ADU. So it has to be looked at from both directions. I didn't quite understand what you said in the 3rd paragraph or 2nd paragraph from the bottom, where you talked about PTC might want to, and ARB might want to pursue development of standards to ensure resulting units align with Palo Alto preferences. Is that something that we would tee up or that council would send to us?
I think the idea, and I'll take the Sheldon, and then if you have something to add, is that part of what we can do with SB9 as a city is have design criteria and objective standards. There are some limitations, which I think, just to review it, because I think it kind of touches on your last question, Commissioner Lowing. The minimum lot size of the beginning lot is 2,400. It can be subdivided. The resulting lots need to be roughly equal. They can be a 40-60 split, so they don't have to be doesn't have to be exactly 1,200 square feet. And then there are some dimensional requirements, such as the minimum setback from the sides and rear is 4 feet. So those are kind of the parameters. And then the state has said otherwise, it's subject to local design criteria that we can set. And so that is something that we have the ability to do. We're going to do, as I think, a good but thorough job as quickly as we can going to December. But there certainly will be more, I would imagine, that with the ARB's help, we could add and shape those criteria, as we develop a more long-term ordinance. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that was really good clarification. Let's see, turn the page. Okay, you already answered that one. On SB 10, off the cuff, can you do any recollection of the definitions of transit-rich area or urban infill site? I'm sure it's in the law.
So you can find it, but
Yeah, it is defined in the law, so Sheldon can look that up. And I think that part of it is the frequency of the transit service is a part of that definition. And then urban infill, we can look at that too. That may be related to definitions also in CEQA, but I'm not sure. So Sheldon can get that for us.
Yeah, agree. We don't have to wait on that now. Just FYI, I could not get that link to work on the Turner Center. It was broken even when I meticulously put in every character as opposed to clicking on it. So something's wrong there. And then also on SB 478, that last bullet point, proposed lot size, et cetera. Are there any restrictions or comments at all on parking in 478? Again, if you don't have that at your hand, we don't have to wait for it, but just. It sounds like you don't, so let's not take.
I don't have that one, but I can refer you to the other question that you had about the transit rich. That's actually in the packet.
Oh.
On the bottom of page 19, number 5, and then the next page, number 6, talks about urban infill site.
Oh, great! It's the same as before.
And I'm not sure. Go ahead, Albert. Sorry.
So I can answer the question on 478. It does not address parking. So it's just saying, here's the minimum FAR that you have to allow if you've got a development of, these many units.
So it just doesn't address it at all?
No.
Okay. Okay, that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lowing, and welcome, Commissioner Chang. We are in our study session. We've had the staff report, and now we're taking questions of commissioners of staff on these new bills. So, Commissioner Templeton or Commissioner Chang, do either of you have questions of staff before we take public comment?
I don't have questions. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate this presentation. I knew there was a lot of stuff going on in Sacramento and a lot of information and misinformation about it. So it's actually a really handy guide. I think this is absolutely wonderful. Thank you for doing that.
All right. Before we move to public comment, let me just ask, point out a couple of issues, I think related to SB 9 to sort of check my understanding. So one thing that is interesting to me about SB 9 is when it's talking about 2 units on a site these new 2 units you could build on a site, I initially was thinking, well, okay, you're building 2 units on a site, single family zoning, we're talking about a duplex, but that's not necessarily so, is it? These can be 2 detached structures on the same parcel. Is that right?
That's correct.
That is correct. Yeah, they could be side by side, they could be on top. Yeah.
And so in that sense, when you look at traditional single family zoning, just like today, we can have our home and a separate detached ADU. Another example of 2 unattached structures on the same parcel. Is that right?
Seems about right, what you're describing, yes.
All right. Then it seems like the rules, well, the number of structures that you can have on a parcel looks like it might be affected by whether or not you engage in the ministerial lot split you're allowed. So let's just look at an existing parcel first that is not doing the lot split. So under SB 9, single family parcel, and let's just say it's vacant, so we don't have to deal with tenants and housing replacement issues. Under SB 9, I can build 2 separate residential structures, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And do we yet have an understanding, if I do that, do we yet have an understanding on that parcel, which now has 2 residential structures, how many, if any, ADUs and JDUs I could build associated with those dwelling units?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I don't think we have a definitive answer yet. And so this is all on a single parcel that hasn't been split. And it comes down to this. There are a bunch of different avenues that the state ADU law takes for, guaranteeing your right to build an ADU. And several of them either are predicated on there being an existing or a proposed single family use. So if you've got 2 structures on this parcel, it's no longer a single family use, it's a 2 family use, right? So I think those avenues to build an ADU are foreclosed. But there's also a couple limited provisions in the state ADU law for ADUs on parcels with multifamily dwellings. And that term isn't defined, so it's possible, under state ADU law, we get guidance that, 2 family use is a multifamily dwelling, so they fall under that, category of what kind of ADUs you can build. But a lot of the rules we have around ADUs are for, parcels with a single family home. And once you've built your second, structure under SB 9, that's not the case anymore. But if you could say, take a parcel, split it under SB 9, build 1 single family home on each, and then you'd be entitled to an ADU and a JADU on each, because you'd have a single family home on each parcel.
Well, let's follow up on that. I think it's item 15 in the staff report that talks about the state can't require the city to allow more than 2 units on a parcel. So in the lots, so I understand the city of Palo Alto would have the discretion to say, in their legislation, we're going to allow in a lot split a single family home, an ADU and a JDU, which I think would be 3 units. Mm-hmm. But the city would also be within its discretion and consistent with state law to say, when you have done the lot split, you can have a maximum of 2 units, whether you want those to be, 2 single family homes on that subdivided parcel, or a home and an ADU, or a home and a JDU. It's got to add up to 2.
Yes, this is a, sort of an inconsistency between SB 9 and the ADU law that, we'll have to take a closer look to see kind of which one is going to rule the day.
Okay. So my sense from this dialogue is right now we have some uncertainty with these brand new laws and how they will interface with the ordinances that City Council will adopt on what the maximum density of parcels that utilize SB 9 will be. So I think that's as far as we can go right now.
I think that's right.
Okay. Commissioner Chang, did I incite a question in your mind?
No, I was just getting caught up. Sorry about having to come late. So I had a question looking at SB 9 that, it's saying that a parcel needs to be at least 2,400 square feet, but we have parcels in Palo Alto that are 10,000 square feet or larger. And so it says that each one can be split into two. Then do we envision that it's possible for each of those two, let's say it's 10,000 and they're each 5,000 to then be further split? Like, so you could end up with, is there anything, maybe I didn't read this carefully enough, but is there anything that prevents like multiple steps of application of SB 9 that would really subdivide a larger lot into many smaller lots?
Yes, Commissioner Chang, yes, there is provision in law that would preclude that from happening. So you can only split the single family lot once.
Thank you.
Right, other commissioner questions of staff? Seeing none, I will open the floor for public comments. Please raise your hand if you wish to speak on this agenda item. On the Zoom app, there's a raise hand button on the bottom of your screen. If you are dialing in from a phone, press *9. Mr. Nguyen, are there any public speakers for this study session item?
Chair Heckman, we currently do not have any speakers for this item.
All right. Then let me bring it back to the commission. As there are no public comments, any further comments, not necessarily questions of staff, but comments that any of the commissioners want to make about these changes in state law and the actions that the city is going to need to take to address them. Mr. Hammond, I see your hand up.
If I may, just make a public comment. I happen to do some of this as a living, and without being too presumptuous.
Can I just pause just for procedural note? It's okay if Mr. Hammond wants to make a public comment, but we would want to do the timer correct on that. I mean, if he's speaking as though he's a member of the public, I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Let me clarify, because he's here as a panelist, I was expecting that he was either a consultant or a member of staff.
He's here for the other item, the item 3. And so it's okay if, I mean, so in some ways, if he wants to make a comment as a member of the public, that's totally, I think, within his rights, but I just want to make sure it's happening properly.
Okay, well, thank you for the clarification. And yeah, I think that's fine. Mr. Hammond, if you'd like to speak to this item, what I'd like to do is reopen the public comment and give you the opportunity to do it in the right setting.
Certainly.
Okay, so we now have your 3-minute clock up, Mr.
Right.
Hammond.
Thank you. Thank you, commissioners. Without any intent to be presumptuous or to make any legal conclusions, I note that there was a question about whether an ADU could be constructed in the context of the lot splits that have been under discussion. And I would suggest to staff that a good place to start to better understand this, the ability of the local agency to restrict ADUs after a lot split would be to look to Government Code 68552.21 subsection F. Again, that's 68552.21 subsection F, which reads in relevant part, notwithstanding sections 685.2.2, a local agency shall not be required to permit an accessory dwelling unit or junior accessory dwelling unit on parcels that use both the authority contained within this section and the authority contained in section 66.411.7. That was my only comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hammond. Since I have public comment open, Mr. Nguyen, are there any other speakers for public comment?
Chair Heckman, we do not have any other speakers.
Okay, then we will close public comment. Bring it back to the commission for any comments or observations that they'd like to make regarding these this housing related legislation. I don't see any commissioner hands, so I will just note that this is some far-reaching legislation that the state has adopted and placed on our doorstep. It can have some potentially significant effects in Palo Alto, and it's clearly planning related. And so as a member of the PTC, I would love to see the legislation that we adopt come through the Planning Commission. Here, however, these laws will take effect January 1st. Today's October 13th. Council ends their year, I think, on December 13th. And there's not time to bring the urgency ordinance. Realistically, I think staff's going to be working up until just about December 6th to get it ready to take to the council. And so I acknowledge in this situation, there's really no choice but to take this urgency ordinance straight to council and bypass the PTC. And in the longer term legislation that comes back hopefully next spring, we'll get our chance to comment and refine that. But I just want to note that wherever possible, these things should come through the PTC. And so if we were talking about this, for example, at our first meeting in September, on September 8th, I would be pushing to find a way to get us an opportunity, even if it was a special meeting for us, to look at this and comment on it before it went to council. But here, I don't think there's time to do that. So, and I appreciate the hard work staff has ahead of it in the next 7 weeks to get this ready for council. That was the only comment I wanted to make. Any other commissioners have anything to say? Any staff comments before I conclude this study session item?
Only comment I wanted to make, which was in response to Mr. Kachang, even though you may not have thought this, but just to be clear, lot splits will still be allowed under other circumstances. So, we're not necessarily throwing out any of our other local procedures to accommodate SB9. What we're proposing probably is to have a subsection that just focuses on if a property owner chooses to avail themselves of the SB9, here are the rules for that. And then, lot splits that sometimes we might see a parcel maps with exceptions, et cetera. That path will still be open for other types of splitting of properties, and the discretion that the commission and the council have to review and to opine on those types of splits.
And actually related to the lot split, Commissioner Chang had brought up this hypothetical about the 10,000 square foot lot. I don't know if Palo Alto has any 5,000 square foot lot zoning, but if we did, theoretically, you could use our subdivision ordinance to take your 10,000 square foot lot and subdivide it into two 5,000s. And then I believe, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, with those two 5,000 square foot lots, then on each of those, you could apply your SB9 lot split.
So that's actually not possible for one individual to do because the law says you, in addition to not being able to do serial splits, you can't do adjacent splits if you're acting in concert. You know, both owners are acting in concert. So if you're the same person, you'd be acting in concert yourself. If you sold them to two separate individuals that were totally unrelated, then they could potentially split each lot in the future. But it's not a way that for one person or one entity to do that.
And the other problem with that, of course, is that one of the requirements for the lot split is that the subdivider has to commit in some sort of recorded declaration, as near as I can tell, to reside in one of the 4 units on the split lot for a period of 3 years. So you couldn't do that if you had these 2 5-acre lots that were each split, creating a total of 8 units. So that's another reason it wouldn't work. All right. So thank you for that clarification, Mr. Yang. All right. Well, so thank you very much, staff, for the informative presentation and the answers to many questions. We will look forward to seeing your urgency ordinance move forward to council and to having these issues come back to us in the spring. With that, I'll conclude the study session item, and I will move us to action item number 3, a public hearing quasi judicial 985 Channing Avenue. It's file number 21 PLN 00167, request for public hearing of a preliminary parcel map to remove a recorded height restriction on the underlying parcel map. Let's see, the environmental assessment is exempt from the provisions of CEQA in accordance with guideline section 15315. The zoning district is R1, single family residential. May we have a staff report, please?
Great. We'll have the staff report from Mr. Garrett Saltz, and then we'll have a presentation also from the applicant as well. Mr. Saltz?
All right, so go ahead and sharing my screen now. Can you let me know if you can see it? Okay,
We
thank you.
can see it, yes.
Okay. All right,
There it goes.
thank you. Sorry, my computer seems to be acting a little slow today, so it might take a second. All right, so as Assistant Director Tanner had mentioned, this is an application for a preliminary parcel map for 985 Channing Avenue. So to give a bit of context about the location of the property, it's located within the Crescent Park neighborhood. It is an existing property that has an existing single-story, single-family home that is surrounded by R1 lots with a mixture of 1- and 2-story homes. The reason this project is before the PTC today primarily stems from a decision that occurred back in 1980. So prior to the creation of the parcel for 985 Channing, it had actually been 1 lot designated as 991 Channing Avenue. At that time in 1980, that lot had been split into 2, which retained 991 Channing Avenue and then created 985 Channing Avenue, the subject parcel. At that time, when the PTC and City Council had approved the parcel map for the application, there were additional conditions that were placed on the structure or on the property and on the parcel map specifically that limited the height of all structures to not exceed 13 feet in height, that no 2-story homes could be developed on the site, and that no variances, including but not limited to fence exceptions, were to be allowed on the property. At the time, the city's zoning code allowed for single-family homes to be built up to 35 feet tall and did not include any privacy provisions, which have since then, been distilled into the city's individual review process and guidelines that city reviews for new 2-story homes. So this project had come to the city as a result of a new 2-story home where the applicant had not been aware at the time that this was an actual limitation on the property. And so through that review process, the public had made some of the adjacent neighbors who will be speaking tonight made it aware to staff that this policy, that this limitation existed on the parcel, and that was communicated to the applicant. And since then, staff's had communications with the applicant about what would be the process in order to remove that limitation. And so one of the ways in conversations with the city's survey, with the city surveyor, was that in order to record or in order to eliminate some of these limitations on this project, on this parcel map, a new preliminary parcel map would need to be recorded. And given that that initial condition had been, or those initial conditions had been imposed by City Council and PTC, the decision-making bodies would need to effectively rescind those previous limits in order for that to go forward, rather than follow the standard process, which is the director would make a decision, that project would need to be, that decision would need to be appealed and then continue through the PTC and City Council process. So the applicant would be looking, if this were to be approved, to propose a new two-story home on the site, in addition to a new ADU on the site as well. That project would go through the IR process and would be reviewed in accordance with our IR guideline policies. So some additional things to keep in mind that I've already kind of highlighted is that, the limitations that are imposed on this property are actually fairly unique. Staff, in doing research for this application, wasn't able to find any other instances in the city where they had applied height limits specific to other sort of properties through a prelim parcel map process. There was one instance that staff had found at a commercial property at 3350 West Bayshore, where the City Council, as a part of the recordation process, limited through a similar means the amount of floor area that could be developed on the site. But other than that, staff was not able to find any other instances where this similar kind of policy has been applied to a single family home or a single family lot. Under those standards at the time, there were not actually identified, there's no distinguishing factors between what's considered a substandard lot and how that can be developed back when this subdivision was initially established. Lots were still considered to be substandard if they were not meeting the standard 60 by 100 foot dimension, which is still in practice today. But in 1998, when the city updated its code, it included substandard development standards for properties. And under those standards, the city had identified that properties which fell underneath a certain dimension and size category would be limited to 17 feet in height and also be limited to a one-story structure. So following the policies that have been changed over the last couple of years, even under today's substandard rules, this lot by its size and dimension would still be allowed to have a two-story home. And so as a result of that, staff's recommendation is that the PTC would be recommending to City Council to remove the height limitations that have been imposed on this property as identified in the findings in Attachment B and the conditions of approval in Attachment C. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Sauls. Commissioner questions of staff before we go to the applicant presentation and public comment? I see no questions from commissioners, so let's open the public hearing, and we start with our applicant, who will have up to 10 minutes. Welcome.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Hi, my name's Shelley Farrell, and I'm here with the project owners, Frank and Grace Dunlap, and their attorney, Steve Hammond. Thank you for being here tonight. This preliminary parcel map application seeks to remove the 3 existing parcel map conditions that were placed on 985 Channing because the current property owners would like the same property development rights enjoyed by their neighbors. I'm asking the commission to vote to eliminate all 3 of the conditions. Next slide. I can't see the slides, by the way.
Neither can I.
I can't either, yeah.
Garrett, do you have the slides?
Let's pause the
Yeah.
time.
Restart the clock.
I can go ahead and share the screen, share that presentation. Give me a second.
Sorry, I just dove right into it.
I don't think we realized until you wanted the next slide that you were afraid to say.
I was warned 10 minutes, like just be fast.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, I think you
I
can
can see it.
probably, you can show them one at a time. There you go. Okay, so I already explained that. You can advance to the next slide, please. This is an excerpt from the parcel map that was that established 985 Channing when it was subdivided from 991 Channing in 1980. The three existing parcel conditions are circled in red in the lower right-hand corner. The conditions you see here block a second-story addition, disallow a variance of any kind, and limit all structures to a maximum height of 13 feet. Next slide. We would like the council to support removing these conditions because the conditions are out of character and not consistent with local ordinances that guide the development of similarly situated lots. The unique height conditions are redundant and no longer necessary because the single family individual review was implemented in 2001. The single family individual review is a methodical and well-developed process that was put into place in an effort to provide uniformity and preservation of the Palo Alto aesthetic while explicitly encouraging two-story additions. The Dunlap's plan includes the creation of a new ADU, and a vertical expansion is needed to accommodate their primary residence and this new unit. The city of Palo Alto and state of California needs more affordable housing. The neighbors who oppose the application enjoy vertical additions that they seek to deny the Dunlaps. Disallowing a variance of any kind in perpetuity prevents the city of Palo Alto from making balanced decisions based on circumstances of the time. Continuing to enforce three arbitrary and severe conditions is not good policy. We need uniform rules. Next slide. The Dunlop's property is located at 985 Channing, which is near the intersection of Channing and Lincoln. Next slide. 985 Channing is located in the Boyce Addition, which is part of the R1 district. Lot types, shapes, sizes vary greatly in this neighborhood. This diagram identifies standard, substandard, flag, and undersized lots that exist here. Next slide. Another study of this same area shows where two-story homes are located now. Two-story buildings occupy 63 of the 104 lots you see shaded in pink here. The predominant character of dwellings that exist in this neighborhood is two-story. Next slide. The Palo Alto Municipal Code specifically contemplates the height for all zoning districts. Here's a copy of the zoning map on the right. This plan is the foundation that the planning code is built on. The R1 district, which you see highlighted in yellow, allows a maximum building height of 30 to 33 feet on standard and undersized lots in this zone. Next slide. These height parameters are easily discovered on the City of Palo Alto Property Information website. For example, if you search for 985 Channing Avenue, you will find this parcel report that includes the zoning district, lot size, lot type, and maximum building height. The information circled in red clearly states that, next slide, 985 Channing is situated in the R1 district. The lot is not substandard, it's undersized. The image you see here is part of a recent site survey that confirms the lot is 5,246 square feet, which is 28 square feet larger than the lot area currently on record. But the maximum building height allowed on this property is much lower than the 30 to 33 feet that is normally allowed. Next slide. 985 Channing is not substandard, but it's treated worse than one. The column on the right represents the maximum building height allowed on Dunlap's property. The existing conditions say that their building cannot exceed 13 feet in height. That's less than half of what is typically allowed on a standard or undersized lot of this size in this location. Next slide. We are requesting to remove the existing parcel conditions to put 985 Channing in parity with its neighbors. Since these conditions were created in 1980, there is now an ordinance and thorough review process, the single family individual review. The whole purpose of this SFIR is to test all potential developments against a sophisticated and comprehensive set of standards that this Palo Alto Municipal Code has put into place to preserve the character of neighborhoods and foster consideration between neighborhoods when there are concerns about massing, scale, privacy, and the streetscape. The first SFIR was put into place in 2001, and it was updated again in 2004, 2005, and again last year. Next slide. This indicates that the rules are not fixed. This indicates that the Planning Commission and City Council continue to revise the SFIR in an effort to provide uniformity and ensure two-story additions are compatible with existing neighborhoods. Vote to remove the existing parcel conditions so the Dunlops have a chance to enjoy the same property rights and development opportunities as the individuals who oppose this application. Next slide. Neighbors who oppose this application reside in homes that exceed 1 story in height. The Uyghurs have contested any development at 985 Channing for 41 years. The abutting neighbor to the north, who also resides on an undersized lot, permitted a 2nd story in 2003. There's no justification for this disparate treatment. Next slide. This is just a photo of the abutting neighbor to the north, 911 Lincoln. Next slide. This is a photo of the neighbors to the west, 985 Channing. Next slide. We're requesting to remove the conditions because Dunlap's plan includes the creation of a new ADU. Removing the existing height conditions would make it possible to accommodate their main residence and a new 800 square foot ADU on this lot. A new ADU will increase the housing supply and help Palo Alto meet the RHNA requirement. New legislation such as SB 9 and SB 10 make it clear that developing single family lots in this manner is the future of California. We need housing. Next, please. We want the Planning and Transportation Commission to support removing all 3 existing parcel map conditions. Removing the conditions will not harm neighbors. Circumstances have changed. The SFIR is in place to evaluate the appropriateness of 2nd story additions. State and local laws are in place to guide the introduction of density through new ADUs. Variances should be allowed per the discretion of the Palo Alto Planning Department. These are good and fair policies that should supersede the arbitrary conditions. Please vote to remove all 3 existing parcel conditions because they promote inequity between neighbors, and there's no reason for disparate treatment. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there, does that conclude the applicant's presentation? You do have a couple more minutes. You mentioned you had some other people with you.
Steve, did you want to talk about any of the findings?
Thank you so much, Shelley. That was an excellent presentation. I would simply reiterate the fact that the single family individual review for 2nd story additions, and I apologize, I think my video is oh, it looks like I can start it now. Here I go. The single family individual review for 2nd story additions really supersedes the need for these old blunt instruments. The individual review is narrowly tailored. It has been extensively developed over 2 decades now, and it is uniquely formulated to preserve the unique character of the Palo Alto neighborhoods, to promote construction compatible with existing residential neighborhoods, to encourage respect for surrounding context in which the residential constructions and alterations take place, and foster consideration of neighbors' concerns with respect to privacy, scale, massing, and streetscape. The individual review is a much more narrowly tailored approach, a much more sophisticated approach to these overbroad restrictions. And so these really are the special conditions and the special circumstances and conditions. What's changed is this SFIR, and the enjoyment of the SFIR process really should be considered a fundamental property right of the owner, and equal treatment and across similar situated homes is an important property right. And this is all very consistent with the policies of Palo Alto, specifically the policy of individual review to encourage new two-story housing and second-story additions
Mr. Hammond,
in a
please
way that
conclude.
balances and is the diversity of the neighborhoods and is consistent with the surrounding neighborhood character. Thank you.
Thank you, applicant. So we will now move to public comments. So typically here we allow each speaker 3 minutes. I have reading the correspondence from neighbors. I want to mention that we also provide an opportunity if people with aligned interests want to combine their time. If there are 5 speakers present, they can combine into a unified presentation of up to 10 minutes. And so I don't know if any of the neighbors, if at least 5 of the speakers want to avail themselves of that. I see I see 2 hands now. Mr. Nguyen, do you want to please call our public commenters?
Yes, our first speaker will be Jennifer, followed by Bev.
Thank you. Welcome.
This is Jennifer Atchison. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. We'd like to actually, hang on just 1 second. Don't start the clock yet, please. We'd like to join video. I'm not sure how to do that here. Could you stop the clock until I figure out this?
The clock is stopped.
Okay. I don't know how to put Dr. Bergosa on. He's my client sitting next to me.
So generally, public comments from the public can't turn on the video, but Chair, if you like, I can promote her to panelists if you want to give her the ability to turn on her video.
Certainly, sure.
Do you want it or not necessarily?
Doesn't matter.
Okay. It's all right. We'll go ahead. I don't see how I can do that, so we'll just go ahead. You can now restart the clock, please.
The clock is restarted. You may begin.
David Ragosa. I am the owner occupant of 991 Channing since June of 1980. Previously submitted statements by me in September 2020 and by my attorney Jennifer Atchison in December 2020 appear in the addendum of the staff report. A written version of these comments submitted today. The legally recorded restrictions that are the focus of this meeting actually appear on my parcel map. It is my parcel map that is subject to being gutted, and I believe I should have substantial standing in these proceedings. The 1980 subdivision of the original 11,000 square foot lot upon which my residence was constructed in 1950 produced 2 residences in very close quarters. Along the 40-foot length of each structure, there exists the most minimal and minimum 6-foot setback on each side. I was hired as Stanford faculty in June of 1980. Thus, my first contact with the property as a potential purchaser was after the parcel map restrictions were put in place. I can recall Bill Cox, the developer, standing with me in the residence, showing me the plans for 985 Channing, structure being framed at the time, and with emphasis showing me parcel map with the restrictions. As a potential purchaser, these restrictions were essential for the viability of my purchase. And I properly regarded such as a guarantee of the future privacy, livability of my residence. In September 2020, a 2-story renovation of 985 Channing was put out for review. On September 23rd, Dr. Loftus informed staff of the parcel map restrictions, as did my letter on September 25th. The staff response was solely to refer to a process for removing those restrictions. no accommodation for us. I do not have a two-story structure. 991 Channing has 2 levels, one below ground, unfinished, and one slightly above ground. Residence rated as 1186 square feet, gutter height 12.5 feet, consistent with a 1-story structure. The 2-story structure at 985 proposed in September 2020 would dominate, swamp, whatever word you like, my much smaller structure. A rebuild of 985 Channing matching my gutter height and roof pitch along our border, I could not describe as catastrophic. Full removal of the height restrictions would be. As a non-lawyer, I describe the removal of these valuable, essential restrictions as an eminent domain taking without compensation, or as advised, a better term, an inverse condemnation. In purchasing my property 41 years ago, I relied on the height restrictions as legally recorded and enforceable contract provisions. What contract or agreement with the city can be regarded as viable if the city can renege on such critical and clear legally recorded restrictions? Before taking any action on this unprecedented application based on the papers before you, I would beseech you to physically visit the site at Channing, stand in the minimal setback between the 2 structures, and visualize the planned construction at 985 submitted in 2020. You will be aghast. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Our next speaker is Bev, and then followed by David. Bev, if you're there, you can unmute yourself and speak.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim and I have owned 975 Channing since 1965 and are very established in our neighborhood. In 1980, when we learned 985 Channing, the house to our east side fence line, was to be built outside of Palo Alto codes at the time, we spearheaded a neighborhood campaign to restrict the home to height and other factors. Those legally placed restrictions were upheld for 40 years. The Keatings were the original owners and residents of the home at 985 Channing. They were aware of the restrictions placed on that parcel, and although they preferred a 2-story home, they did not try to change the planning regulations. In 1989, the 1-story home at 955 Channing on our west side fence line was raised and a new 2-story home was built, to our disappointment. Our very narrow 40-foot parcel lot and home were being encroached upon. In 1998, Michel Debard bought and resided at 985 Channing. He sold it in 2000, however, after he was made aware of the restrictions imposed on the parcel. In 1999, Jim and I planned to construct a 2-story on our own house, but found the regulations would not allow our building specs. Thus, we modified our plans and only built a small attic. We do not have a 2nd story. We honored the rules and regulations. Early 2021, the Palo Alto City Council held their annual retreat. If you listen to that recording, you will hear many members state they, quote, should strive to assure Palo Alto remains a great place to live and to preserve the quality of life for all, unquote. In addition to those remarks, preserving the character of Palo Alto neighborhoods is one of the first items noted in the city's IR guidelines. The character of our neighborhood is slowly eroding and our personal quality of life is being infringed upon. Until the time of the subdivision of parcel 991 Channing we enjoyed the unique character of our immediate neighborhood, the spacing of lots and the charm of the surrounding homes. Since that time, we feel the proximity of the newly built homes on either side of us is intrusive. The existing homes at 955 and 985 Channing make us feel our space was invaded, giving us less natural sunlight from sunsets and sunrises. Each seems to occur at least 1 hour outside of their actual times. We lost the comfortable feeling of single home ownership also. We feel like apartment dwellers since we are so closed in on both sides already. If the current proposal of lifting restrictions on 985 Channing is approved, we will lose the limited morning sunlight that we see today. Our photos, which we submitted today, show how little the natural morning sunlight is in our east side facing window. Additional height placed on 985 Channing will still hinder that sunlight, just as 955 Channing showed us so many years ago. We will require our lights and our heating system to make up for the wonderful natural light and heat that sunshine normally offers. That happened to us in 1989, and we know it will happen again. As senior citizens on fixed incomes, we will continue to feel the financial impacts. We ask you to deny removing the longstanding restrictions set on 985 Channing for the applicants. The Dunlaps have never resided at 985 Channing, so really have no feel for the neighborhood's character. Their actions do not mirror the actions of the many resident owners before them that respected and adhered to the zoning rules, regulations, restrictions, and ordinances. So we ask that you keep our neighborhood as it is today and preserve our quality of life.
Thank you for your comments. Our next and final speaker is David.
David Loftus. Thank you to the PTC for allowing our voices to be heard, and thank you for the continuance of this matter from September 8th. The subdivision of 991 Channing Avenue to create a new parcel was indeed an unusual step because it allowed a new house to be squeezed in among long existing older homes, more than 30 years after the last adjacent house was built. All of the houses next door to 985 Channing were built in 1950 or before. 991 Channing was built in 1948, 975 Channing in 1950, and 911 Lincoln in 1934. There was a neighborhood outcry about this subdivision event back in 1980, which resulted in the decision by the PTC to place partial restrictions on 985 Channing, including the height limit of 13 feet. In 1980, a house was built at 985 Channing, but just a one-story house consistent with the rules. The decision by the PTC 41 years ago to place restrictions was excellent because it took into account the interests of the surrounding homeowners. The partial restriction accomplished its purpose, and it has been working well ever since it was put in place. Previous owners of 985 Channing have abided by the restrictions. Current owners should too. We've owned our home, 911 Lincoln, for more than 30 years. We love it here and we are dedicated to the neighborhood. When we added a second story to our home in 2005, we faced many restrictions. We abided by those restrictions. We did not try to change the rules. We appreciate that the applicants, Frank Dunlap and Pai Min Lin, want to enlarge 985 Channing for the benefit of their family, but the current rules need to be followed, including the height limit of 13 feet. We expect the city of Palo Alto to support us and the other adjacent homeowners and not try to change the rules. Based on information provided to us by the city, there is no precedent for undoing partial restrictions of this type on a residential property. We say, let's not start now. If the partial restrictions on 985 Channing are removed, it will pull the rug out from under the adjacent homeowners who have benefited from the partial restrictions for many years. If the second story is allowed to be built, it will further bulk up our local section of the neighborhood, resulting in a large structure that looms over our backyard and negatively impacts our view and our sense of privacy. We vehemently object to the removal of the longstanding partial restrictions, and we vehemently object to the building of a second story at 985 Channing Avenue. Signed, David and Juanita Loftus and Boys.
Thank you for your comments. Chair Heckman, that concludes public comments for this item.
Thank you. Under our process, at the conclusion of a quasi-judicial public comment, we allow the applicant the opportunity for rebuttal comments of up to 5 minutes. You don't have to take advantage of that opportunity, but I wanted to let you know you have that ability and find out if you have concluding remarks. Ms. Farrell?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I had to turn my microphone back on. I would just say that any proposed addition is going to go through a very thorough review process with the planning department and adhere to all of the new ordinances regarding setbacks, daylight plane recognition, massing, offsetting of windows to ensure privacy. So the concerns of the neighbors will be addressed. Any proposed development will also be shared with all neighbors within a 300-foot radius. So there will be a time for conversation back and forth if there are any very specific concerns that need to be addressed in the design.
This is Steve Hammond. If I think we may have a minute or two left, if I may speak.
Sure.
Commissioners, I certainly echo Shelley's comments with respect to the IR process and the fact that, you know, these are modern times and there's a modern mechanism to address the neighbors' concerns, and no one is suggesting otherwise. There have been some comments about the legality of the changes, the remedy that the Dunlaps seek, and you know, if there are concerns about that, we're certainly willing to follow up with additional information that addresses those concerns. As we sit here today, I'm quite confident that a removal, a new parcel map that remove these restrictions would not be the type of property damage for public use that would trigger a reverse condemnation claim or anything along those lines. But again, we're certainly willing to address those issues if they are concerns. That is all. Thank you very much. I appreciate your consideration this evening.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I will now bring it back to the commission for discussion and ultimately a motion on a recommendation to the city council. And so we will start with Commissioner Lowy. Commissioner Lowy, before you start, let me suggest that let's each take no more than 5 minutes for a preliminary set of comments. If you have more, we'll come back around a second time.
I was just going to ask that procedural question if you wanted to do actually just questions in the first round to kind of set up the questions. So obviously up to you. Just want to know what rules to follow.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's start with questions of staff, and then we can, after the commissioners have asked their questions, then we can follow up with further discussion. Commissioner Lowy, you want to lead off?
Yeah, thank you. So to staff, if you could just sort of take us back. None of us were there in 1980, but the results are there here in the cornerstone of City Hall. We have this document. So in 1980, this result came about in the ways that we've been told about. PTC and council voted to approve it. And the restrictions were recorded in the site map and also in the deed. Is that correct?
My understanding is that it was on the parcel map, not necessarily in any sort of deed restriction.
Okay, but the parcel map is part and parcel of any exchange of ownership of the property. So it'd be both disclosed and understood by the seller and the buyer. And just to confirm, there was no limitation in time. There was no sunset or anything like that. At the time, it was meant to go into perpetuity.
Right. So in the supporting documents, there's kind of a capture as, you know, good or bad as limited as much as what we were able to really find, unfortunately, in our history. The conditions were not identified to say, you know, it shall be this way for 10, 15, 20 years. It was simply a more standard condition, which is supposed to be kind of there forever, right? Until something changes it.
Right. So it's supposed to be there forever on that unit in that neighborhood. So having read the packet a number of times over the last 2 months, since it's come back to us fine. But so what is your contention now as to why the individual review guidelines should actually even come into play on something that's already been documented 40 years ago, knowing that they're there and we're all glad that they're there, but why do these guidelines done in 2000 or something actually have any bearing on this? I think that's kind of the first substantive point that we have to figure out.
Right. So a number of the issues that were raised back in 1980, based on the history of what we were being able to pull up, were concerns related to privacy. Commissioners at the time, also highlighted, are there means to establish privacy on the property or ensure that something like that would go forward? They also had discussed at the time, was there potential to establish a single story condition, which, as we now see, was established as a part of a condition for that map. And at the time, as is indicated in the staff report, the city's zoning code for R1 regulations was very minimal. It was almost about a page long, whereas now, if you were to try to print it out, it'd probably be about 20 pages long, or potentially more. And since then, as a result of a lot of neighbor concerns related to privacy, massing, and impacts from new two-story homes through that semi-unregulated condition that residents were experiencing, the city's residents and architect and staff came together to develop this individual review program specifically to try to address those concerns. The issue obviously at this specific parcel is that no building is really made or able to be developed on the site over 13 feet tall, so they would not necessarily be able to even potentially consider doing something that would be like a two-story home. So the issue primarily, again, is just related to whether those policies at the time were the appropriate mechanism to try to limit what could be impacts from a two-story home that at the time had been potentially considered, and whether or not the changes that have been adopted since then are appropriate enough to protect against the concerns that neighbors certainly still have and we experience all the time in that individual review process.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's sort of that the problem was solved, but this might be a better solution. Is that a way of understanding staff's position?
Are you suggesting that the better solution would be to retain?
No, I'm saying that since the problem's already been solved, I think staff's position, as I'm understanding it, is that instead using the new IR guidelines that were developed 20 years after the fact might be a better way to solve the problem that was solved a different way in 1980. Just trying to understand the kind of logic.
I think that I don't know that we would say better or worse in that type of kind of subjective value, but certainly that it would seem that some of the concerns, perhaps not all of the concerns that neighbors expressed now and that we could understand were expressed at the time, are addressed through the IR guideline process. And so that if those concerns are there, that perhaps they can be addressed through that process and then allow this home to have the same development standards that the neighboring homes would be subject to were they to want to build a second story. Certainly reasonable people can disagree with that and certainly can also see the perspective that you kind of shared and or like, that this was here and thought it would be here, in perpetuity.
Okay, you got my questions answered. Thank you. That's all, Chair Bart.
Thank you. Vice Chair Rupavar, questions?
Yeah, city staff, can you give a brief overview as to what the IR process looks like from a procedural standpoint, not substantive, like what the regulations are, but I want to better understand, how many meetings do you have? Are neighbors involved? Is there input taken into consideration? Can you just give more of an understanding as to how that process works procedurally, how long it takes?
Sure. So when an application is submitted to the city, the project is noticed to properties within 150 foot radius of the subject site. And within that, the code technically says that within 20, there's a 21-day period that residents have a time to provide comments for. Staff has been more, historically staff has been more lenient to receive comments at any time and work with applicants and work with residents to kind of assuage some of those concerns as best as possible in relationship to the policies that we have, because they are guidelines. They're not necessarily more strict applications of follow this section, follow this setback, follow this daylight plane. And so to that extent, once someone submits those applications, we would typically share those public comments received with the applicant. We would provide our own comments to the applicant as well about how that project conforms to the IR guidelines. And when the applicant resubmits, the requirement that we have is that they respond to those comments and identify and modify their designs to demonstrate how they are better complying or better conforming to the IR guidelines. Many projects have significant changes. Some projects have minor changes. Projects from applicants who repeatedly provide applications in the city have become familiar with what our expectations are and are familiar with proposing structures that are from the get-go more consistent with the IR guidelines than less. Once we are able to make a decision on the project, we believe the staff has done their review and we believe that it is consistent with the IR guidelines. A decision would be rendered and that decision letter would be sent out to residents within 150-foot radius. At that time, that application could be appealed and a director's hearing can be called to discuss that item. Once that director's hearing is finished, that item can again be appealed to the PTC, who would then make a recommendation to City Council based on the director's decision and staff's input.
Got it.
And
And
the
then-
applicant and resident concerns.
And to quickly clarify, the IR guidelines are all subjective or a combo of objective and subjective standard? Is it don't infringe on privacy, or is it, you need to stay within X of the daylight plane?
Right, so it's a bit of both. So there is subjectivity to how it is implemented. And so a lot of that discretion is discussed between the applicant and the staff, and at times also residents who are very interested and concerned about the impacts that the structure can have. And so there is a conversation that occurs between these groups where it's not necessarily so rigid as, again, follow this setback or follow this daylight plane generally. There may be things where we say you need to maybe encourage, when you're adjacent to a single story home, you need to give more space underneath the daylight plane to be considerate of those structures. And so those are things that we commonly review with these applications to push applications to be more or even more consistent with the IR guidelines than what is typically or maybe considered as typically the case, right? Where someone might say to staff, my application on its face complies with the base zone standards. That's not necessarily the bare minimum that they have to meet. And staff oftentimes pushes applicants further than that.
Got it. Thank you.
Commissioner Chang, questions?
Thank you, Chair Heckman. My question is, okay, on packet page 26, it stated that the decision-making bodies that impose these restrictions need to be the body to rescind them. And so I'm wondering, legally, what are the criteria on which we are required to, or are there any criteria we're required to consider in deciding whether to continue or rescind the restrictions? And I ask because there isn't a precedent specifically for this type of restriction. I mean, I understand that the process that has been laid out in our packet is to go through a standard, the standard consideration that we would do in terms of needing to make findings for a preliminary parcel map for a subdivision, but we're not subdividing this lot. So I'm wondering what legal guidance there is in terms of what we should be considering.
Yeah, so I think, as you mentioned, Commissioner Chang, what's presented in the staff report are the typical findings that apply to a subdivision of a property. And although we're not creating any new or different shaped lots in this process, the question is still the same. So presumably in 1980, the PTC or the council were able to make the findings that were required at the time based on the existence of these conditions. And so the question now is, can you make the findings that are presented to you without the conditions? And that's really, the standard that's being asked of the PTC.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that explains to me why we received the packet that we received, but I still wonder, I mean, is there any, like, this is not an analogous situation, if that makes sense. We don't, is there any precedent at all for, or an analogy that you can draw that kind of explains why this makes sense? Because I'm just kind of, and I wish we had the findings from before to understand what those were, but if they weren't made in the same way, then we can't reverse them in the same way. I think I understand your explanation, but it still doesn't quite answer my question, but thank you.
I guess I could, try to make, provide an analogy. So let's say there were, a conditional use permit that restricted, the hours of certain operations to times where the noise that would be created wouldn't be problematic. And then over the course of time, there was a change in technology that eliminated that noise, right? So now perhaps like trucks are silent because they're all electric. So your delivery trucks aren't making the same amount of noise. That holder of the CUP could come to the city and say, I'd like a new CUP that doesn't have that, hours of operation restriction because the noise isn't an issue anymore. And then the question before the PTC at that time would be, can you make the CUP findings that you need to make without having that noise restriction in place?
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Templeton.
Hi, thank you. And thank you to the applicants and the public commenters for shining some additional light on this application. I'm gonna ask staff here to do a little more work. Your presentation is extremely succinct, and possibly that may be some of the consternation that the commissioners are going through. We may need a little bit more scaffolding in order to analyze this and come to an agreement. So what I would ask is, staff, are you able to project packet page 32? This is, sometimes in the past, we have had a slide that will summarize the findings that are required, but I didn't see that in the slide deck that was sent to us, nor in any pocket slides in that. But if you did have it in a slide, of course, that would be acceptable as well.
Sure, let me go ahead and pull up the packet.
So the history, while you're doing that, just let me opine a bit. The history of this is all very interesting, adds a lot of color to this discussion. But I think that the way I'm looking at it, I appreciate what Mr. Yang just said. I think that's the right way to look at it, is what is the situation now? And have we made the findings to address approval or denial of the application? Because we can't go back and change time, and we can't predict the future. All we can do is analyze where we're at and what the ask is in front of us. And with sympathies to the folks that have called in with concerns about future developments, we don't have that in front of us. As a body, the PTC right now has in front of us an application to change a parcel map and findings that we must make in order to approve or deny that. Is that a correct assessment, Mr. Sauls?
Yeah, and Mr. Yang, you may be able to answer this a little bit more too. But primarily, what the findings kind of do is they almost ask to make like a reverse finding. That they don't necessarily create these issues because they're kind of set up more in this negative context of, saying it does create this, it does create this concern, or it does create this problem. So what the findings are trying to show is really that there are not going to be these impacts to these adjacent properties. And certainly, as you've identified earlier, over time, things, impacts will change. And much of the language is very squishy, right? How you talk about general or specific, or sorry, consistent with, that it's going to not create some sort of, damage to, the welfare of, the general populace or anything like that. It's very kind of vague and open-ended, which, like Assistant Director Tanner said earlier, rational minds can disagree with. And so,
okay. So are we evaluating hypothetical structures at this point, or just looking at these criteria, the 7 criteria that are laid out?
So this specific application focuses on the boundaries of the parcels itself and the limitations that have been placed on it. The subsequent application would focus on the impacts to massing and privacy that'd be reviewed through the IR project.
Great. I think that's really important distinction, because there's a lot that we could be discussing and that has been brought up tonight, and we really need to bound and have some structure to this discussion, I think, in order to move forward. So I appreciate that clarification. Okay, so to keep to our time limit that the chair has set, I'm not going to get into 1 through 7, but I appreciate you having it available for us to refer to as we go the next round. Specifically, can we make the findings 1 through 7 that staff have recommended? So I'll just leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Templeton, Vice Chair Ripavar, I see your hand up. Let me ask a few questions and then I will come back to you. Let's see, the first question, and this ties into some earlier question from another commissioner, but I heard Mr. Rugosa during his comments expressed concern over a plan he had seen that was submitted to the city for redevelopment of 985 Channing that it sounds like involved a proposed 2-story house and an ADU. Mr. Sauls has that, and I understood the same from the staff report. But my impression from the staff report is that that proposed development has not yet been through the SFIR process. Is that right?
Right, so it was submitted and we provided our initial comment letter, but it has not been resubmitted pending the decision and outcome of this project. So it effectively, as what is indicated in the staff report, it's on hold pending this decision.
And as you described the process in response to, I think, Vice Chair Rupavar's question, the next step in the process, ignoring this issue that we're dealing with, is the applicants for that IR would submit revised plans, and they may revise them a little, they may revise them a lot, but the goal is that they revise them to address staff comments. And that process and the ability of the neighbors to review revised plans, none of that has happened yet, right?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. I also heard Ms. Uyghur, who resides next door at 975 Channing, talk about a process regarding their home where at one point they had looked into developing a second story, and it wasn't clear to me what happened, what dissuaded them, but they ended up doing, I think what she described as a minor roof addition. And so I was curious if staff happened to know if that property 975 Channing is a substandard parcel that would be subject to the 17-foot limit for that's the question. I was trying to understand what the hiccup was in their effort to develop a second story.
Right. So looking at the parcel, there are multiple criteria that define whether or not something is substandard. One that is either has a width or a depth that's less than 50 feet in width or 83 feet in depth, and that it is less than 83% of the base R1 zoning requirements, and so or the base zone district's requirements. And so looking at the parcel report, the property is less than 50 feet, so it would meet that kind of first criteria, but it is not less than the 83% required based on that underlying zone district. So while it may be a more narrow lot, it does not preclude the applicant from proposing a two-story home. I can't speak obviously to their personal interest in doing one or not at the time, but looking into the plans around the time, it is true they ended up doing a attic addition, which kind of adds kind of like a clear story space, looking at the street view onto the property, kind of this sub second floor layer, kind of on top of their structure. But they did not propose a full two-story home.
Thank you for that clarification. And one more question. This one is for you, Mr. Yang. This is maybe a question of form and not substance, but the Subdivision Map Act allows a map that's been approved and recorded to be amended. For example, if we had an easement on running through land on a map and decided the easement should be located in a different place, we go through a map amendment process. Here, it seems like the approach that's being taken is to record a new parcel map, and I'm just curious if there's a reason that process was chosen instead of an amendment, or is it? I mean, it may be functionally. I think it's the same, but I was curious as to why this particular vehicle was chosen.
I don't have a complete answer for that. I think that given the amount of kind of interest we had in this issue, we wanted to make sure that it went through a hearing process and was decided upon by the City Council, and the process that we have laid out in our code for that was one of recording a new parcel map.
All right, those are my questions. Vice Chair Rupavar.
Yeah, I had a similar question that touched on what you just said, and Commissioner Chang. I just want to make sure, because it's thrown me off. This process is for like approving a parcel map is for a subdivision, but the subdivision's already happened and we don't have a project before us. So it seems like we're using the wrong mechanism, but what the thrust of like what staff and the applicant are saying is that times have changed, we've modernized. So we should take that into account and therefore like approve it, yet we don't have a subdivision or a project before us. It's, hey, approve the fact that we're going to deal with it in this other form through the IR process review. So that's what's tripping me up. I don't know if it's, I think it's maybe form over substance, but can you shed some light on that a little bit more? Am I understanding this correctly?
I'll ask Mr. Yang to join me in answering, but I think part of it is just to even think about what happens in the IR process. Those don't come before this commission. This commission does not review or approve IR projects. And so procedurally, there's no project to bring before you for approval in terms of approving a two-story home or reviewing that. That has its own process. And so, and likewise, we cannot accept and process an application for a two-story home unless the parcel map is amended, or in this case, a new parcel map is created that allows, would allow a height that would allow a two-story home. And so there's not a mechanism to advance or even really consider that other application. And even if we did consider it, it wouldn't come before this body for approval. And so I think Mr. Yang is just trying to say, if the reverse findings that must be made for a subdivision, those were made at the time of this maps being drawn. And to go back through it, basically to reverse the decision, which is to remove that condition, this body and the council would need to find that they cannot make any of the reverse findings based on the height, but the bodies may decide that these do have adverse impacts as outlined in those findings, and that one of them is made, and therefore they cannot approve the new parcel map.
Yeah, no, I get the IR stuff doesn't come before us, but when I'm looking at the findings, it keeps talking about the proposed subdivision, but we don't have a proposed subdivision. The subdivision's already happened. There's no proposed subdivision. It's just one property that's already been subdivided. So like, maybe I'm getting like caught up on words, like maybe an amendment would have been a better mechanism, but that's what's tripping me out because we don't have a proposed subdivision. Okay,
Right. So
I'm good. Yeah.
I guess I can jump in just briefly on this. So our code and the MAP Act do deal with amendments. They are primarily meant to deal with corrections of errors and kind of minor issues. And so there isn't a list of findings having that, touches on the, kind of like the policy fit of what's being proposed in the amendment process. Whereas in this case, I understand that, yes, we already have two parcels, but there's still this question of, these two parcels were found not to have detrimental impacts when these conditions were included. And the question that needs to be answered, that's being asked right now, is, will these same two parcels also still not have detrimental impacts, without those conditions? I know it's not exactly the same, but it's a little bit, in my mind, it's somewhat like having a one lot map for condominium purposes. You're really just creating one lot that's still there. You're just saying, I'm also going to be creating condominiums through the separate, state condominium process. So I understand we're not drawing new lines, but in staff's view, the questions that are being asked by the required findings are still relevant.
Thank you.
Commissioner Chang, before I call on you, let me just mention Mr. Hammond. I do see your hand up, but I won't be calling on you. The opportunity for public or applicant to weigh in absent a question from a commissioner has passed. So I appreciate that you may have had something you thought you could contribute on the legal issue, but we're going to keep it with the commission. So didn't want your arm to get tired. All right, Commissioner Chang.
Chair Heckman and Vice Chair Rubervar really appreciate the questions that you're asking from a legal perspective, because I think that's what I was trying to get at. And what I would like to understand now from Mr. Yang is what would the requirements be that we follow for a map amendment process differ from those of a subdivision process? In other words, with the subdivision and the preliminary parcel map, we have to have certain findings. What's the bar or the threshold that we need to meet for a map amendment?
To be honest, there don't seem to be a set of clearly defined findings that are required for map amendments. In part, I think that's because the MAP Act, contemplates them for what seem to be more technical errors. And while our code does allow them for kind of a broader range of issues, we don't define the findings that apply to those situations.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lowing, questions. It's 8 o'clock, and what I was thinking, if we get through the questions, then we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back to further our deliberation. So if you have more questions, let's ask them now. If you're ready to start discussion, then I'd ask you to wait till after the break. What's your pleasure?
We're on the same page. That's just what I was going to ask you, because I am ready to make some comments on what council said and commissioner said.
Okay, very good.
I do have just one addendum to my response to Commissioner Chang just now. On further reflection, our code says we'd have to determine that the map conforms to the provisions of the Subdivision Map Act, and I guess we could read that to mean that we'd have to make the same findings, right, that you have to make for any map. So it'd be essentially the same process.
All right, thank you, Mr. Yang. So we are going to now take a 10-minute break. I have 8:05, so we will resume at 8:15. Zoom.
All right, great. I think that if it's okay with the chair, I think that our attorney may have some remarks. Or Albert, would you like the commission to deliberate before sharing some of your concepts?
I think it would help if we as staff just took a minute to discuss. Chair, if you wouldn't mind, if we could take another 2 minutes and come back.
Let us know when you're ready.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, if commissioners didn't get a blanket and a warm beverage, I highly recommend it. It's really cold.
I used more energy and turned up the heat. I should have gotten the blanket.
Commissioner Chang has her blanket too. I love it.
I did dig out the corduroys before this meeting, though.
I had that thought myself, Ed. All right, I think we're still recording though, right?
Yeah.
All right.
And let the record reflect that I don't own corduroys.
So sorry to hear about that. You deserve some luxuries.
I might have to look into that.
Chair Ackman, did you change your background photo? Is that the most recent? Is the overpass done now?
It's not. It's not. This is the one I put up after they added the missing link. But they are still slowly, as near as I can tell, installing the railing. So it's not open yet. And perhaps at the end of the meeting tonight, Ms. Tanner may have an update for us. Yeah.
That'd be great.
Since we have a minute, I will share with the commission what I believe to be kind of a this day in Palo Alto history thing, not for today, but coming up in November, I believe is the 100th anniversary of the construction of the transmission tower in the Baylands near the Rensselaer Marsh and Ponds, which was, I think, a 694-foot tall transmission tower, the first of its kind on the West Coast. It's near that white building you see sitting out in the middle of the marsh, which I think was called I want to say it was the ITT building. There's actually is that Ed saying that's right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you bike up to or walk up to the top of the Bixby Park, on the part of the trail that overlooks that building, there's actually some information about the building and its history. So, but it was a century ago this fall that happened. So, and to my knowledge, it's one of the earliest examples of Palo Alto as a technological leader. I might get an email from some member of our historical society if I've badly botched any of those facts.
That's pretty cool, Chair.
I think you should be proactive and research it and come back with the real answer in case you screwed it up. When I was on the Parks Commission, we got a private tour of that because it's all locked down and it's not good inside. It's been, before they locked it down, it had been vandalized and so on, but it's just amazing the history there. During the war, they did special things out there with some ancient looking technology, but you're right, Barty, it was technology and it was leading edge, in 1940. It was just amazing that that's just sitting there. I walked over there the other day and said, that building doesn't look too good, but if you knew what was inside, you understand the historical value of it. It's pretty cool.
For members of the public and the applicant who are here, it's not typical for us to take a prolonged break like this, but I hope you can appreciate that we're trying to get to the right answer and the right process, and with some kinds of requests that we don't handle often, it takes a little more time to do it. So appreciate your patience.
All right, thank you everyone for your patience, Chair and Commission. As you just mentioned, this isn't an application type request that we encounter often, and we've discovered, in part as a result of the Commission's questions, that there is actually an additional set of findings that should be applied to this situation, and so we'll put them up now so that you can see them, but we would recommend a continuance of the item so that the applicant and the public can both analyze and speak to the additional findings. So here they are, and this is something that applies to an amending map. The process is largely basically exactly the same as the process we'd followed, but we just need to take account of these additional findings here. They are first, that there are changes in circumstances which make any or all the conditions of the map no longer appropriate or necessary, that modifications do not impose any additional burden on the present fee owner of the property. The modifications do not alter any right, title, or interest in the real property reflected on the recorded map. And the map is, as modified, conforms to the provisions of the Subdivision Map Act and the Palo Alto Municipal Code, Chapter 21.16.
So we just want to recognize this is not our normal way of proceeding, but we did want to bring this to the commission's attention as soon as we were aware of it, and certainly to the applicant and those who are present. We do apologize for the oversight of this little used section of our municipal code that did portend the possibility of amendments to final maps. We'll let the commissioners take a look at it. I see folks studying it, and you may have additional questions regarding these findings or questions or comments related to previous discussion.
Chair, may I ask a question of staff?
Commissioner Lowing has his hand up first. I'm going to find out if you have a question of staff, Commissioner Lowing.
Yeah, I was just going to ask for clarification on a couple of these things, but if Commissioner Templeton wants to go first, that's fine.
Thank you, Commissioner Lowing. I'll be very quick. I just was going to ask staff to please send this out, even if it's a little in advance of the updated packet. If you could just send this out to us to start looking at it. Thanks.
Certainly.
Commissioner Lowing.
A couple questions about this, and then I want to make a comment on what council just said. On number 2, could you make sure we understand what that means, burden on the present fee owner of the property?
Yeah, so that basically means burdens on the owner of the properties that are on the map. So in this case, that there are 2 parcels that are created, it would be, I think, both of those owners would be relevant in terms of the burdens, whether there are any new burdens. And fee owners just refers to the type of ownership. It means it's not a lease, or it's the typical form of ownership that you would encounter.
So if I understood you correctly, that's not just the applicant, but the other person that is impacted by the parcel map?
So that is
I just want to allow Mr. Yang, if you don't know the answer right now, I think that's okay if you need some time to research it. But perhaps, I don't want to say that you don't know the answer, but I know that this is some new information that you're also trying to assess.
Yeah, I think that this was something that will have a more definite answer in an amended staff report. But typically, when you have a map, you have a single owner of the property that is subdividing that land. And so this provision refers just to a single owner. Although this is something that is applicable to amended maps. And in this situation, we have 2 owners of the properties that are shown on the map. So it's something we'll have to look at. It's a good question.
Okay, so under the circumstances, and to make sure that this is the final findings, I would concur with the recommendation to continue this. If you need a motion on that, Chair Heckman.
I may in just a moment, but a couple of questions of staff first. When staff brings this back, my anticipation is just as you have in, I think it's attachment B to our current staff report, set forth the required negative findings and staff's effort regarding each of those findings. My expectation is when this comes back, staff would have worked through these 4 findings, including the issue that Commissioner Lowing brought up, and present us with staff's recommendations for each of those 4 findings. Is that the anticipation from staff?
Yes, Chair.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And does staff have an idea of when it would be ready to come back to us with the findings presented sufficiently in advance of that for the applicant, the neighbors, and the commissioners to review those things?
I would, based on the progress of this hearing and considering there are both the applicant and concerned neighbors, want to put this to our hearing in November with the idea that maybe we can publish something, provide some insight, of course, to the parties earlier. We can see what that can look like, but I do think October, end of this month, may be too soon, just because we'll need to turn around that report and then folks won't take time to look at it. So that's my inclination, but certainly open to other staff thoughts about the timing and Mr. Yang's thoughts as well.
I'm in agreement. I think that November is the likely timeframe.
November hearing is November 10th for the members of the public. Commissioner Lowing, your hand is still up. Do you mean it to be?
Nope, not unless you want me to make a motion.
Well, let's see. I see Mr. Hammond's hand up, and I'm interested in hearing from the applicant. I presume your motion is going to be to continue it to November 10th. And I am interested in knowing in advance from the applicant if that's a date of availability for them. And so I'm willing to recognize Mr. Hammond, not for any substantive discussion. You'll have an opportunity to respond to findings, once they're drafted, but rather on the availability of the applicant to a continued date of November 10th. Mr. Hammond, can you address that for us?
I am available November 10th. And let me just check to see, Mr. Dunlap is available November 10th. I believe that, I haven't heard from Shelley, but I believe that November 10th would work, and that the risk of incurring your wrath, I would, and it's probably not necessary, simply request any continuance be done, continued such that this, the public and applicant comment period is left open.
Fair request, Mr. Hammond, and I was intending to do that. These new findings need to be commented on by all interested parties. So when we reconvene on this, I will be reopening both for the applicant and any other interested parties to make comments, and frankly, encourage everyone with an interest in this to send us written comments in advance so that we have more time to digest them. Okay, Commissioner Chang, I think I saw your hand go up but then down. So I'm going to ask Commissioner Lowing if he would like to make a motion now.
I'd like to move continuance of this item to the November, excuse me, to the November meeting.
I'll second. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Vice Chair Rupavar. Any discussion from any commissioners on the motion? Seeing none, Mr. Nguyen, will you conduct a roll call vote on the continuance?
Yes. Commissioner Allcheck is absent. Commissioner Chang,
Yes.
Chair Heckman,
Yes.
Commissioner Lowing,
Yes.
Vice Chair Rupavar,
Yes.
Commissioner Suma is absent. Commissioner Templeton.
Yes.
Okay, the motion carries 5-0 with 2 commissioners absent.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and particularly thank you to staff. It's more important, obviously, to get it right than to get it done. So we're on the path to doing that, and so I appreciate staff's quick work to find the section and give us a path forward. So we will now move to approval of minutes, and I think we have, is it the September 8th minutes as modified? for us tonight? Let's see.
Thank you, commissioners and staff. Good night.
Can I have a motion on the modified September 8th minutes, please? Please.
Move to approve.
Thank you. A second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Vice Chair Rupert. All right. Mr. Nguyen, a roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Chang,
Yes.
Chair Heckman,
Yes.
Commissioner Lowing,
Yes.
Vice Chair Rupert,
Yes.
Commissioner Templeton.
Yes.
The motion carries 5-0 with 2 commissioners absent.
Thank you. Committee items. Any commissioners with committee items?
Yes.
Commissioner Lowing.
Yes, just wanted to give a brief update on the Housing Element Committee. We are now doubling down. We're going to 2 meetings a month to accelerate the kind of the whole situation because there were some developments in state government where the deadlines were moved more earlier. And so we're obviously going to accommodate that. And otherwise, I think it's going quite well. As I said last time, very good participation and increasingly good participation across the board from all members as it was intended. So that's all.
I don't have a committee item, but I know Commissioner Suma is not here, so she may normally have reported on the NVCAP occurrences. And the council did review the NVCAP and gave staff direction, generally aligned with alternative 1, which was kind of the lower development alternative, with some carve outs for different things, and we'll be coming back in December to the council just to ensure that we understood correctly what they chose, because they kind of chose different elements of some of the different alternatives and added a few requests for some more information. So we'll be going back to the council in December on that item.
All right, thank you. Anything else under the committee items? How about commissioner questions, comments, announcements, or future agenda items? Commissioner Lowing.
I just want to get some visibility on the October 27th item about electrification streamlining. Do we think that's the only agenda item, and is it long or short, just to kind of plan ahead?
It probably will be our only agenda item. We've been trying to manage the calendar, and things keep moving as they do. I don't know that it will be particularly long. Just overall, the idea is we're working, primarily electrification relates to building permits, not a lot of planning related to it. And in particular, the city is working to try to get more like EV chargers at home, solar panels, things like that, more electricity instead of other things like gas. And so trying to think about how we can reduce the review time for those permits. And particularly, can we get some of the planning review maybe done by the plan review staff or the plan checkers versus planners. And so that's the ideas we'll be bringing forward, are some perhaps code amendments that might codify the plan review requirements in different parts of our code, and just basically try to streamline those applications, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks.
And might you have any update on the structure above my head?
I don't know any updates on that. I had to miss our last infrastructure committee meeting, but I can reach out and see what the plans are for the bridge.
I have seen them, workers out there occasionally working on the railing, which it seems to be making progress.
Yeah,
but I'd appreciate it.
Soon, that'd be nice.
All right, not seeing any additional hands from commissioners. I will declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you all.